a pleasure to be here to show a little bit about the work we've been doing. I have a presentation that I can share. I will share my screen soon. But just as Tom mentioned, Trace is a transparency initiative that we try to increase transparency in the supply chains in the sense that consumer markets can better understand where the commodities that they are importing or they are purchasing is coming from, and also which are the the environmental and the social impacts associated with those trades, associated with those products that are being exported from many places and mostly in tropical areas to consumer markets all around the world. So I will just share my screen quickly. And please let me know, Tom, if you can see it.
Yeah, that looks good. Nice and clear.
Perfect. So, I mean, just a little bit of an agenda. So I will start bringing a bit of a context, why Trace was developed and why is that information important. Then I will go to a platform that we have online, which is freely available for everyone. I think Tom will send the link soon in the chat. So I would showcase what's just provide a demo, how you can use the information, how can you extract information from the platform. Then I will bring a few examples of insights and information that we can have out of this data that we gathered. And then hopefully Sarah Maslin, as Tom mentioned, will come in later to show and share a bit of her experience using the data in a very interesting article that she published last year. And then I can come back a little bit later after Sarah to touch base a little bit on the methodology, limitations, assumptions of the data that we have. And then we can go to questions and discussion. So I would like to start, I think it's always nice to start with this video, which is part of, it's just a really small video, 1 minute video, which is an extract from the BBC documentary Extinctions, the Facts, that was narrated by David Attenborough, which showcase Trace and its value. So I think it's just a good start to set the stage for our conversation today.
It's estimated that every year around 3.8 million hectares of forest are cleared.
A lot of that clearance is driven by demand on the other side of the world. We want cheap food and we want to have choice on offer all year round.
These commodities often provide the mainstay of countries' economies, but many are produced in ways that are not sustainable.
So a consumer walking into a supermarket may unwittingly be contributing towards loss of biodiversity. What we're doing is taking customs data, shipping data, and for the first time, we connect them all together and ask who's buying from the hotspots where we're really losing biodiversity. We now have enough data to be able to identify the main drivers of biodiversity loss. Soy, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, and beef.
Great. I think as the video showed really well, as we already know what's behind deforestation. And if we look back between 2013 and 2019, we saw that more than 60% of all the deforestation happening in tropical areas was driven by commercial agriculture, and mostly by the so-called soft commodities, which are basically cattle, soybeans, palm oil, and timber. So those commodities are absolutely important for our economy nowadays, and they are mostly produced in tropical areas, but then they are traded to all over the world, including China, Europe, and many other regions. So if the demand for those commodities is global, and also the deforestation impacts, the loss of biodiversity, the CO2 emissions related to the deforestation, they are also impacting a global scale. So then we think that the responsibilities of those impacts should be also shared across the supply chain, not just on the producing side, but also the demand side that is actually, behind the demand as well. But the problem is that the supply chains are extremely complex. So one product can be exported, so it can be produced, for example, in Brazil, then it's processed and stored, and there's so many routes and ways that this commodity goes until it ends up, in a shelf of a supermarket in China, for example. So we need more information to be able to identify the actors and where this commodity is coming from. So we had really, really interesting information from the resources trades and the Chatham House here that, map this trade flows, this commodities flows from one country to other regions around the world. But there were two main things missing here in this data if we were to start connecting the trade with the impacts on the ground. So first is where exactly these commodities are coming from. Where, for example, in this case, within Brazil, is it coming from the Amazon? Is it coming from the Cerrado? Where exactly in the Amazon it's coming from? And also, who are the traders? Who are the companies that are exporting and importing these commodities that, should be also part of the challenge to build more and more sustainable supply chains. And that's exactly why Trace was developed for. So the idea was to break down those complex supply chains and bring more transparency, linking the production from the local areas where the commodity is produced, including the exporters, the importers, and the country of destination. So I will just move to a quick demonstration of the platform that we have online. Let me go here. Great. So we have, as I mentioned before, we have a Trase.earth. It's a platform online which is freely available for everyone. And one of the main features of the platform is this map, the supply chain map. So here we are looking at all the soy exports and traded from Brazil to all around the world. So we are seeing here, for example, all the municipalities. Municipalities, for those who are not familiar with, is the smallest administrative unit in Brazil. So we have all the information of the municipalities, how much was produced in those municipalities, who are the exporters, importers, and the countries of destination. So for example, if we are interested in one single company, let's say, for example, Amagi or ADM, we can just click here in ADM and we can see exactly where ADM sourced or bought their soy from in Brazil and where exactly it's going to. The same way that we can do this for one company, we can check many other companies in the supply chain. And we can also do the same for the countries of destination. So for example, here we have China, Brazil, Europe. If I click here in Europe, we can see exactly where the soy that Europe imported from Brazil came from and which are the traders involved. We can also do that not just for municipality, but we can change the biome and then see how much of the soy from Europe, for example. Here, if I expand this flow, we can see how much it came from the Cerrado, which is a very important and threatened biome in Brazil, from the Atlantic forest, from the Amazon, and so on. And we can see this in a sort of a Sankey diagram, the flows, but we can also change here to the data, and then we can see the information in a more digestible way. So we can see how much the European Union imported soy from Brazil, the countries within Europe, the top exporters, the top importers, and so on. Or we can also just go back here. We can also search one municipality. For example, if we are doing an investigative piece on focus on one municipality, I can just enter the name here in the the search box, and I can see go and check more details about this specific municipality in Brazil and see which are the companies and where the soy produced in these municipalities is coming from. just to mention, this is, I'm showing just the soy supply chain, but we also have information for palm oil, beef, shrimp, cocoa, all around the world. So right now, the idea is to map most of the commodities that are linked to deforestation. The ultimate goal is to map at least 70% of the commodities that are linked to deforestation in the different areas. So if I just go back there, so once we start go mapping, sorry, I would just clear the selection and go back to the municipalities. So once we start going mapping these commodities from the port of import in one country back to the local, to the areas where it was produced, then that's exactly when we can assess the impact on the ground. And for that we created, so here we were looking at volumes, right, in tons, but we can change the unit here and start looking at the soy deforestation risk, which is basically a quantitative measure or indicator that helps us to understand how much of that soy that one country, for example, is importing is likely to be coming from recently deforested areas. So for example, one area that was deforested in 2018 and then became soy in 2019, or let's say in 15 and then 16, and then we can see here in hectares how much of one company, for example, is exposed to this deforestation risk. Or in other words, what's the exposure that Bunge, or the likelihood that Bunge is exporting or trading soy that was produced in recently deforested areas. So as I said, we assess this in a quantitative way. It's called the soy deforestation risk, which is basically an indicator that the unit is hectares. I will be explaining in more detail how we calculate this. I think this must be a question that you guys have in mind, but then we can dive into the methods, the limitations, the assumptions of this information. And we also have in the platform, we also have this insights page that actually, just insights, some analysis, some of the studies that we produced, you can assess them here. We have the insights, we have the publications are all available, and we also have a yearbook that brings kind of all the analysis, all the insights that we had last year, for example, combined in one place here that you can assess all the information. Cool, so we'll go back to the presentation. So what can actually we do with data? So first, we can understand which are the main markets, in this case of soy produced in Brazil. So we saw that Europe was a big player, or the most important player until 2010, and then China came in, and now China actually pulls ahead as the main market for soy. Second, we can then understand what's the market share of those companies that are exporting commodities from these tropical regions to many consumer markets. So for example, there is a huge dominance. Only 5 companies in general account for 50% of soy exported from Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, beef from Brazil and Paraguay, and palm oil from Indonesia. So the market's really dominated by a few companies. And in those contexts that I mentioned, 5 companies handled most of, at least half of the exports from these countries to consumer markets. But then we can also do some more in-depth and interesting analysis. So here we are looking at all the China soy imports from Brazil. And it's very interesting to see that of all the imports, around 1/3 or 35% of the volume that they imported from Brazil came from this region here in the south of Brazil, which is really far from the deforestation area. And therefore, the deforestation risk is really low. Then we can see how much is coming from the Amazon, which is around 10% of the volume that import in 2018 came from the Amazon biome, which accounts for all the deforestation risk associated to China imports from Brazil. It's only 7%. But then when we look at this region here in red, which is called Mato Piba, we see that although only 9% of the volume came from this region, actually it accounted for 80% of the deforestation associated with the soy that China was importing to. And if we go one step further, then we can see which are the companies that are trading from these areas, this specific area in Brazil. So only 5 companies accounted for 75% of exports from this region in Mato Piba here in Brazil, where the deforestation risk is really concentrated directly to China. So, I mean, it's a really powerful and insightful information in the meaning of, you know, we can help Chinese buyers, the Chinese government, to address the problem. So where they should focus, where they should prioritize their actions, their investments, their efforts in general, and which are the companies that they should be engaging with. You know, they should at least be asking those companies whether they have what we call the zero deforestation commitments or any policies, you know, to address and mitigate these risks of being exporting soy and other commodities that are linked to deforestation or that are produced in recently deforested areas. So it's really interesting to talk about the zero deforestation commitments, which is basically when a company publicizes a policy saying, I no longer want to purchase commodities that are linked to deforestation or coming from deforested areas. And it's like, it's been increasing the number of companies that are signing and are publishing these commitments. But one thing is to make these commitments. Another thing is to implement them, right? So when we look at our data and we check if the companies that are exporting have commitments or not, we see that around 80% of the companies that export palm oil from Indonesia, or 80% of the volume that is palm oil exported from Indonesia, is traded by companies that already have a deforestation commitment, already have a policy to address that problem. In the case of soy from South America, it's around 60%, depending on the country, is covered by zero deforestation commitment. And in the case of the beef, we see that there's still a lot of companies that haven't made commitments. So only 32% of the total volume exported from Brazil is traded by companies which have, or from places that are covered by deforestation commitments. But as I mentioned, great. I mean, this is a great information to see whether, you know, companies need to step up and make more commitments or not. But how about whether are they actually implementing those commitments or not? So when we look at this, when we compare the risks that those companies are exposed to in the different contexts, we see that yet there is no difference between that and the risk of companies that have commitments and companies that don't have commitments. So we still have to see, you know, it's still quite early to say this, but, you know, we want to see this information here, this chart moving. So for example, here in green, we are looking at companies with commitments, and in red, companies with no commitments. So in the future, we want to see this companies less exposed to risk. So we want to see this green bar staying here and the red one going up, and see, you know, to really see that those commitments are making a difference. So I think one of the main messages is that, you know, sourcing patterns really matter. So, you know, it really depends on where the companies are actually sourcing from. So we see here, for example, that sourcing of soy, beef, and palm oil from high risk areas can associate it with up to 10 times average carbon emissions, which means basically, you know, they source from the areas, how can I say, the deforestation frontiers, and therefore that's where, you know, because of the deforestation, there is more carbon emissions. So, you know, they are more exposed to risks. So that really matters. And another message that we found, and it's really interesting, I think it's the key fact here that we keep bringing to our users, is that although it seems very complex to address that problem, actually the deforestation risk associated to the trade is really concentrated in a few places. So in the case of Brazilian soy, for example, half of all the soy deforestation risk, or half of all the risk that this commodity is associated with deforestation is concentrated in just 1% of all the soy producing municipalities in Brazil. In the case of beef from Brazil, 2%, Argentina, 2%, Paraguay, soy from Paraguay, 15%. So it's really concentrated across the commodities, across the countries where they are produced. So that's a very powerful message for the consumer markets to see where they should focus their efforts. And I just wanted to bring another example here, how we can connect, right? Because we map the supply chains from the producing localities until the consumer markets. So it's kind of a bridge, that we can link with many other information on the ground to start assessing impacts. So we did this exercise last year and connected the supply chain, the soy supply chain, the exports from Brazil, with analysis of deforestation for soy, and check whether it was legal or illegal at a farm level. And we saw that 95% of the deforestation on soy farms in Brazil was illegal. And 80% of that illegal deforestation on soy farms took place on just 400 farms in the state of Mato Grosso, which represents 2% of all the soy farms in the state. So showing again that this deforestation, in this case, illegal deforestation, was highly concentrated in just a few guys. So it's really important to differentiate the good, let's say, the good guys that are producing sustainably, that are putting efforts to make their soil more sustainable and deforestation free, for those who are insisting in deforesting to produce commodities. And we saw that over 80% of that soy produced on farms where illegal deforestation took place was estimated to be exported to global markets. And around 20% of the soy imports in 2018 from the EU were potentially contaminated with illegal deforestation. In other words, were coming from at least 20% of that soy were likely to have come from these farms where the illegal deforestation took place. Okay, but I think it's important just to mention who has been using the data or who we are targeting to use this data for. I mean, one thing that has been happening here in Europe is, the governments are sort of stepping up their game and now trying to put new regulations in place to address that imported deforestation. And France went ahead in 2017 and launched a new regulation to address that problem. But from their perspective, from a French buyer perspective, they had no idea where the information, where the soy was coming from, because soy, for example, is used for, is embedded into chicken, is used for animal feeds. So they have information of who is, producing that chicken and providing the chicken for them, but sometimes they don't have information after that, the other part of the supply chain. So we made a partnership with the French government, and now they embedded our data, our platform into their website to help the private sector in France, to address that problem, again, to see where they should prioritize their efforts. And since the last 2 years, there's a lot of really big interest of, journalists, of the media platforms in using the data, in their investigative pieces, to at least to start the investigation, or sometimes to get more information about the companies itself. So I bring here some of these mentions, for example, The Guardian, the Financial Times, Dialogo Chino, which I think there are a few journalists today here, but many other media outlets around the world using the data, to improve accountability of companies and to better explore how these markets, in China, in Europe, are actually connected with impacts, with fire, with deforestation on the ground. And one of the highlights of this recent coverages by the media is these two pieces that were published last year by The Economist, which hopefully Sarah will be here to share a little bit more how the challenges or how she used the data. But we published a report on the illegal deforestation associated to soy, and then Sarah and her team worked on two amazing pieces on The Economist that were published last year, in June last year. So I hope Sarah is here. So I mean, it would be great if she's here, and then she can share a little bit about how she used the data in a journalist perspective.
She's not with us just yet, Andre, but I have had a message that she is on her way. So if you want to maybe expand on some of the methodology, and then we'll come back to Sarah.
Great. Yes, sure. I don't know if we should just take a quick, like 2-3 minutes break and answer any questions so far, and then we can, because then I can dive into the methods and data sets, which might be a bit more overwhelming and more information. So if there is any quick questions, I'm happy to jump into them now.
Yeah, that's a good plan. We have one question saying, how do you build up these links and the information on those links, and how often do you update the data on the platform?
I mean, that's exactly what I meant to start talking about now, the methods and data sets. So I hope I will answer this question. I don't know if there is any other question, or if anyone wants to ask any other questions now.
Yes, okay, a couple more have just come in. So do you see the platform expanding to cover more parts of the world, specifically India?
I mean, it really depends. We want to achieve, the overall goal is to achieve this 70% of coverage of commodities that are linked to deforestation. I mean, I have to say that it's not an easy, we're going to dive into methods and data sets. It's not really easy to build this supply chains. It really depends on the data sets available in each country. We do have some plans to expand, but we want to, in these next 5 years, we want to really focus now on a few commodities that are driving most of the impact, and really, focus on the deployment, on like making sure the information is available, is updated, and then the target, also the decision makers, are using this information to improve the decisions.
While we're on the subject, then, are there any countries and regions that are missing from your data set, and where are the biggest gaps at the moment?
I mean, we don't cover many of African countries that produce, many commodities. We are going to have data on cocoa for a few countries in Africa, but as I said, it's a balance, right? To try to put efforts in mapping the whole commodity supply chain against, like focusing on the priority ones that are like driving the bulk of deforestation.
Sure. Okay. And other ways, and how do you see the tool being useful for individual consumers?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, Tom?
Other ways currently that the tool is useful for individual consumers, and how do you see that working?
So yeah, I mean, we have been working, for example, because if we talk about one company, let's say Tesco here in the UK, it's hard for them to ask their suppliers to change their behavior on the ground. But once we start working with, because they don't have leverage, right? So it's just part of the soils that produce that Tesco consumes. But if we gather the consumers together, so here in the UK, we've been working, with the Soy Buyers Coalition, which now changed name, to sort of that companies come together and send this signal that they first want to understand where the soy is coming from, so then they can share some of the data links that they have, but also, send this clear signal to the consumer market saying, yes, we as consumer here in the UK, for example, we don't want soy coming from deforested areas. So then, the government and the producers, the private sector in Brazil and South America, for example, have to respond to that.
Okay, thank you. We don't have more questions at the moment, and Sarah's not here. Well, maybe I can just ask you a quick question from my own point of view. Do you have risks beyond deforestation for methodology, and do you see the platform expanding to cover other risks such as human rights abuses, etc.?
That's a really good question. I mean, yeah. So the main indicator that we have is deforestation risk, which I showed. We have another indicator, which is called the CO2 emissions related to deforestation. So basically to have a proxy of climate impacts associated to the trades. And then we have the volume as an indicator. We have the economic value of those trades. So this is the core indicators that we want to have. In some cases, we also want to expand to social risks and to other risks, but it really depends on the data sets that are available in each country. In the case of social risks, which is an interesting one, the data is quite patchy. So we have good information from one region, sometimes not from another region, and as we cover the whole exports. Then if we show that on the platform, it might not see it fair to show that we have only data from one side, and therefore it might seem that area is more associated with social risks, but that's not the reality.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. There is one more question. So companies that are mentioned in the platform associated with a risk of deforestation, it usually says that this does not mean actual deforestation. So maybe this will come up in the methodologies, but how do you answer and address that kind of difficulty?
I mean, that's a brilliant question as well. And I think that's part of the theory of change. I mean, we would like to have information from farm to all the way to the supermarket shelf, but that's impossible, simply because companies don't disclose the data sets. So we had to use all the public available data sets to sort of reconstruct those supply chains and create a metric, to assess the exposure of those companies to deforestation. So the answer is, if that company think it's unfair to show, to see like, yeah, we don't source from that area, or our monitoring system doesn't allow us to buy from deforested areas. I mean, the answer is, it's great. And if they share the data, we are keen to sort of, to explore that, to recalibrate their risks, because it's a data science approach, right? So if we have more robust information, we are always keen to keep, improving the model, we keep improving the data sets to represent even more the reality in a more accurate way. But the theory of change is really, until the companies don't disclose data to show to the civil society, to show to us that they are not linked to deforestation, I think that's the best what we can do with public data available.
Okay, and then a couple of other elements of risks or unsustainable production. Do you see yourselves being able to collect data on things like pesticide and water use?
It's really hard to tell. I mean, in Brazil, there is some data. For example, I don't know about Indonesia, for example. But we haven't explored connecting this to the data set so far. But it could be an option. I mean, we do have some, for example, water scarcity. We have an indicator in the platform that shows that. I'm not sure how updated it is. It really depends on the country and the context that we work on. But yeah, it's something that could be explored in the future, especially by using the data and trying to link it, as we did for illegal deforestation, for example. It could be linked with other data sets in the country to explore those links.
Okay, and then this may also be a methodology question, but how are you able to identify the individual farms in each commodity?
Sorry, say it again.
How are you able to identify the individual farms in each commodity producing municipality?
So it's important to mention, I'm going to go on the methods now, but it's important to mention that we don't go to a farm level. We only go to a municipality level, and therefore we create this a assessment of exposure to risks. But I think this will be clearer once I go through the methodology.
Okay, well, actually, Sarah has just arrived. So if you want to go back to the investigations that Sarah published, we should be able to get her to speak a little bit more about her experience.
So maybe just to brief mention to Sarah. Sarah, I just went through the Trase data, a bit of insights, and then at the end here I mentioned some of the media cover in the last 2 years that has been increasing quite a lot. I mentioned a bit of the illegal deforestation reports that we published last year, and then I finished here highlighting I think one of the highlights of Trase covering the media, which was a brilliant work that you did with this publication of 2 articles in The Economist in June last year. So it would be great to hear, from your perspective, what the challenges and how you use Trase in this work.
Sure. Let me talk a bit about what we did. And I mean, I guess I wanted to describe sort of the origins of this piece and how it is that we ended up working together with you. I mean, we felt like there was just really a ton of excellent coverage of the Amazon and of deforestation in both Brazilian media and international press. And it really kind of picked up the summer of 2019 when there were these fires that really kind of cast a spotlight on the connection between fires and the sort of drying out of the forest and deforestation and climate change, and of course Bolsonaro and his environmental policy. But we thought that something was sort of missing in this wave of coverage of the Amazon, which was an investigation of the supply chains driving illegal tree clearing, and really an explanation of why these international stakeholders, many of whom are listed on on US stock exchanges, haven't tried harder to eliminate it. And we wanted to show the problem with data, which is where Trase came in, but we also wanted to talk to them. And so one of the ways that this data was so useful to us is it allowed us to approach these companies and say, we have evidence that in this municipality, you're buying X% of the soy or X% of the beef. We also have evidence that beef from this municipality is tainted. There's a lot of deforestation in this municipality. And as Andre was saying, Trase doesn't go to the individual farm level. So there wasn't sort of a smoking gun, but it was enough. And they understood that this is a problem. It was enough to sort of start a conversation with companies that, to be honest, really don't usually talk to journalists. And we talked to nearly all of them. And so, I guess the data was really useful in showing us sort of where to focus, which companies we wanted to try to interview. I think it also kind of helped to unpick the narrative that the government always projects, which is that deforestation is all kind of criminals off in the forest with chainsaws, and farmers are sort of the good ones who are trying to do the right thing. We were able to say, no, actually, yes, deforestation is a complex system that involves all sorts of actors, and the time that these companies come in is, at the very end when the kind of damage has already been done. But on the other hand, at some points in the story, I think we mentioned kind of the profit of these companies compared to the amount that they're spending on initiatives to try to deal with this problem. And it is really clear that they haven't done much. They could have done much more. And we also got into sort of some of the ideas for solutions. So, I guess the kind of hopeful bit of all of this, and this is, I'm sure, a result of the work that groups like Trase are doing along with journalists to show, the nitty gritty of why this is happening, is that a lot of these companies have plans to try to fix it. Some of them are, we can always say, and we will probably say, that they're going way too slowly. They're not spending enough. They're not their deadlines are far away in the future. And in the past, they've sort of blown past these deadlines and made new ones. However, they all at this point say, we know this is a problem. We know this data exists. Some of them even, I think are kind of working, I don't know if with Trace or with kind of other groups, but they're aware of this data and are even using it in their own kind of company risk assessments as to where they're going to buy. I know supermarkets definitely are, but they also are trying to do things like using blockchain to try to have a better idea, get their suppliers to from the very beginning of the chain, get on board with tracking these animals. There's kind of lobbying in the government to get the government to get on board, which unfortunately probably won't happen with this government, but maybe could happen with the next government. And so I think that, just to sort of sum it up, the existence of this data has made a real difference for us in how we cover it, and it's allowed us to hold more accountable the companies that are involved, and I think is probably responsible for the pressure that they've been getting from some of the big financial services groups, asset managers, and so on, along with supermarkets like Carrefour, and just in the past year or so since we came out with our story and a bunch of other stories that use trace data, some of these big beef and soy companies have started to make concrete commitments.
And just while we're on that then, before we go to Andrea's more detailed methodology, there is a question which speaks to that and may have come up in some of the interviews, Sarah. So someone's asking, to what extent is deforestation risk already built into companies' ESG commitments, or are they more focused on social risks like exploitation of labor?
This maybe is just changing a tiny bit now, but when I wrote this story a year ago, it was almost not there at all. To the point where I remember kind of going through a report that was prepared by one of the major banks. I forget if it was Itaú or one of the others, about the beef companies and the opportunity for investment, because they were all doing very well thanks to China and its kind of growing appetite for beef. And I don't think the word deforestation was even in this report. I mean, not even once. And so, I mean, some of these companies have a whole lot of, Brazilian investors. They're also, the way that they are kind of in profiles of international investors is usually as part of a pension fund or an asset manager and so on. So I think, there isn't kind of yet the awareness that you would want about the kind of role that these companies play in deforestation. And so that usually, hasn't been part of the conversation, but I think that is starting to change because of the attention that has been, brought to the issue from data like this and, journalism that uses it.
Great stuff.
I think this is a really good point, Sarah. And I think just to mention that we created last year an equivalent platform that I showed here, which is the Trace Finance, because we were missing that gap. The finance institutions normally don't have those policies, so we need to somehow hold them accountable. We need somehow to show what's the risk that they are exposed to. And we've been working on this. So we launched the platform, which kind of associates the deforestation risk that I mentioned in this platform to the flows, to the capital flows, to the money flows, and then give a little bit of deforestation risk to these finance institutions as well. And the conversation has started, and some of them are really keen to address that. But I mean, to be honest, they were completely lost in the beginning. They didn't know, they didn't have a clue where to start with.
Yeah, no, that sounds exactly, sounds exactly right. The conversation, a lot of the kind of banks that, that invest in these companies here in Brazil, banks that I speak to on, a regular basis for all sorts of stories about the economy, strangely all had other commitments when I tried to speak to them about these companies. So that was a real sign to me. I couldn't get anyone to speak to me on the record from the major Brazilian banks.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and perhaps we'll come back to some of that. So we'll have a little bit more time for questions later. But Andre, I want to get into a little bit more of the detail of the methodology and stuff. So if you're ready for that, that would be great.
Sure, yes. So I will quickly go through the methods behind all this data. So, I mean, the important thing is to mention just from the start is there is no spatial explicit data connecting, commodities flows from farm to reprocessing facilities or to the ports of exports and to the consumer market. So we had to build, we had to use the data sets that were publicly available to reconstruct those supply chains, at scale. So, I mean, the methods behind this data is basically, I like mentioning that it's broken into three main steps. The first one is mapping the supply chain. The second one is mapping the deforestation driven by a commodity. So understanding how much of the soy is produced on recently deforested areas, or beef, or cocoa or palm oil. And the third one is bringing these two together and allocate the deforestation risk to the markets and to the actors. So everything starts, when we go to one country and see like, okay, beef is driving deforestation in Brazil, and we want to start mapping it to the exports. So we start looking at all the data available, any data that the government has, any data on deforestation, any data on commodity supply chains, and it really depends on the data availability for us and the accuracy of each model. It varies across the context according to the data that is available. But basically what we do is a decision tree based approach to try to bring all the data sets and triangulate them to see like, great, that's, that where the commodity is coming from. So we use data sets like shipment data, asset ownership, self-disclosed data by companies, production data, tax records. And then when we map one commodity, for example, soy, we call it soy, but we use this weight-based commodity equivalence to map all the, for example, the soy, oil, and cake and beans exports to just one single value, which we call in this case soybeans. So we convert the soy oil volume exports into soybeans just to make it easier in the platform. So great, how do we start? So everything starts, or the backbone, as we say in Trase, is the shipment records, which is customs declaration, bills of lading. So basically all the data that is available in the customs that we can purchase or acquire in the countries. So for example, in this case, we saw that there's one in the shipment declaration, the customs declaration, there's one row that says ADM exported 600,000 tons of soy to China. So this is our starting point. And the shipment records has information like the trades, the volume of the commodity that has been exported, the volume, the port where it is leaving the country, the exporter, the importer, and the country of destination, as well as the value, the economic value. So in this case, we saw in this the AGM case that was leaving from the port of Salvador in Bahia in Brazil. Great. And another information it has in the customs declaration is where the tax for that commodity was paid, which then links us back to the municipality where the commodity was last stored or processed. So we can use, the codes, the tax codes, to link that ship back to a processing or a storage facility. So before this step, we obviously have to map all the silos, all the processing facilities, like the crushing facilities in the case of soy, or the storage facilities, and their ownership and the capacity of storage, for example. And in this case, the tax information in the customs declaration indicated that the commodity was less stored in this municipality in Brazil, Luiz Eduardo Magalhães. And then when we saw the assets, the company's assets, we saw that indeed ADM owned a silo there. So we said, great. So from the port of export, we linked back to the silo, to where the commodity was stored. So that was basically, in most of the cases, just a data-driven, getting the information, linking them together, and then making the visualization, right? But the problem is from the silo back to the farms. That's where we actually have to, include some science-based approach modeling to try to build the supply chain. In the case of soy, what we do is we know the silo here, we know how much the silo can storage, and we use all the information that we can to put into a model, which we call linear programming approach, basically to maximize the allocation of soy from that silo back to the municipalities around, take into account companies' assets. For example, some companies own farms, in the case of Amagi. So we know it's more likely that the soy from this silo is coming from the farms, owned by the same company around. We also take into consideration the distance, using the roads and the cost of transport, to using the approach, the linear programming approach, to optimize the soy allocation. And we also use the production of soy in each municipality to constrain, the flows from the silo back to the municipality. So obviously, if one municipality produce 200 tons of soy, we won't allocate 300 tons to this municipality. So it's constrained by the model. So we put all this information into the model, and then we run this model for one silo. And then we run information for all the silos, all the crushing facilities across the country. And that as we get a good estimate where the silos, these crushing facilities are, getting their soy from around. In the case of beef, in the case of cattle in Brazil, we have some more information, which is the GTA, which is basically a data set that every farmer has to issue a document, or has to get a document, saying how many cows are being transported from one farm to another farm and from one farm to the slaughterhouse. And then we can we can use this information, to map from the slaughterhouse back to the farm. So in the case of beef, it's easier, and in some cases it's more accurate than others. In the case of palm oil, pulp, wood and pulp in Indonesia, as most of the pulp production, or the timber production, is certified by FSC, and FSC, for example, has information about the farmers where the eucalyptus or the species is produced. Then we can link back to the farm. So, and it's important to mention that we have different confidence levels of these flows. So, for example, in the case of shrimp as well, because of the sustainability certification, because part of the shrimp production is also certified, it also helps us to go back to the pond where it was produced. So then we have more accuracy. We are more confident that it's coming from those areas. With beef as well. And when we have no information whatsoever, then we allocate that flow, or we assign that flow as unknown. And for example, in the soy exports from Brazil, the 2018 data, I think we have about between 15 to 20% of the flows we classified as unknown, because we don't have enough accuracy to be confident enough to link back to a producing locality. In the case of beef, for example, in the customs data, we can link directly to the slaughterhouse by a unique asset identifier, by a unique coder in the 80% of the exports from Brazil. And about 8% is, we know that the parent or subsidiary business operates a slaughterhouse, that company is exporting, operates a slaughterhouse in a given municipality. So I would say that about 85% in the case of beef back to the slaughterhouse is pretty data driven. As I said, it's just like bringing the data together and make them more digestible for visualizing it. Great, so that's how we do to map the supply chain. And then the next step is to map the deforestation associated to that commodity. And for that, I think that's kind of easier to explain. So basically what we do is we get the map of soybeans in Brazil, soybeans production in Brazil, and we overlap with official data sets on deforestation provided by the government. So we overlap them, soy farm, soy production with deforestation, and then we can see where soy was planted in recently deforested areas. In the case of soy in Brazil, we use a window of 5 years. So basically, if one area was deforested in 2015 and that area became soy in the next 5 years, we allocate that deforestation for soy. And that's because we know that normally it takes between 3 years and a half to 5 years for an area to, after it's deforested, to be planted with soy. That's because it's part of the land speculation process. It's part of a bigger picture, and also takes a bit of time to prepare the lands for planting soy in some areas. So any deforestation or any soy that is grown on areas that was deforested 5 years ago, we allocate that soy with deforestation. Great. So basically here, let's take an example, a municipality here. And we map the land use, or we get information of the land use of this municipality. And for example, here using the government data, we saw where the different polygons of deforestation in that municipality. And we also use data from partners, from universities and other places that map the soy production. So let's imagine this is the soy production map. This is the deforestation. Overlapping both of them, we see this here. So let's imagine each of these square represents 2 hectares of deforestation. So we see here that in this municipality, this soy here, or 10 hectares, it was 10 hectares of deforestation associated with soy. Great. So then the next step is to allocate that risk or that deforestation to the companies that trade soy from these municipalities. So let's assume that this municipality traded around 1,000 tons of soy, and there were just two traders purchasing soy from that municipality. A trader A, which purchased 400 tons or 40% of the soy produced in that municipality, and a trader B, 600 tons, 60% of the soy produced in that municipality. What we do is basically we get this deforestation for soy, again, 10 hectares, and we allocate that according to the volume that the company purchased from that municipality. So the trader A purchased 40% from that municipality, they get 40% of the deforestation associated to soy, therefore 4 hectares. The trader B, 60%, therefore 60% of the risk, and 6 hectares. So basically, we allocate that risk. We know on the ground, we know how much of soy is planted or was planted in these recently deforested areas. Then we just allocate this risk we know in hectares, right? In polygons. So we take that 10 hectares and allocate to the traders according to the volume that they purchase. And that's because basically there's no, as I said many times, there's no spatially explicit information of soy traded from let's for example assume the trader A might have a really good monitoring system and they might be purchased only the soy that is not linked to deforestation, but we don't know that. They don't provide information. So we allocate the risk according to the volume, and we put the as we say the proof of the onus to them to show that they are not purchasing soy from those recently deforested areas. So just to wrap up about what we do is basically we only map a commodity if we can map the whole export, or the whole production and export from that region. And that's what we do for all the commodities that we have in so far. And it's really important to mention, as there is a modeling involved, as it's a science-based approach, it's an estimation of the places of origin. Some people just see this as a reality, but that's not the reality. That's not, companies have much more granular data. What we do, again, is get these public data sets and try to build the supply chain the most accurate as possible according to science-based approach. And this deforestation risk is just a measure of the exposure. We don't say that company is driving deforestation. We are just measuring the risk that company is exposed to as they purchase from those areas that were deforested for soy. And as I said, it's a science-based approach, so we are under continuous improvement. Just to have an idea, the Brazilian soy map is already on the 6th version. So we started back in 2016 with some information, some data, but then we kept improving as the information, as we found some mistakes, some error, as we spoke with companies, and companies, gave us more information. So we are under continuous improvement, and we are always open for feedback and improvement, as I said, because it's basically, based on science. And here's just some sources that I can, as Tom said, we're going to share this slide deck, so then you can have more information about the methods. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Andre. So yeah, we are now looking for some questions. If we don't have any more coming in right now in the Q&A, I wanted to check in, Andre, on the acquisition of data. So some of this data presumably is proprietary. And what's the kind of negotiation process with the companies who are producing and collating this data?
So I think it varies from country to country. For example, from Brazil, the customs declaration data was available for purchase. Anyone could purchase the data and have this information, and that's what we used to do. There has been some changes now, with the new government, and we are not able to access customs declaration anymore. So we have to use other types of per shipment data to reconstruct the supply chain, which makes our life much harder. So we really depend on transparency of each country, to be able to have our hands in the data.
Yeah, so actually a question has just come in on this. So do you use Panjiva and other data providers like that?
Which
Panjiva?
data, sorry?
Panjiva?
Panjiva.
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of. I can check with the data team, but I'm not aware of this information.
Okay. So there are other sources for the kind of bill of lading trade.
Yeah, and for example, in Europe, they don't provide the customs data. They don't let people purchase the data. In Brazil, they used to do. In China, it's possible you can purchase the data. So it's a bit of a shame that the EU doesn't allow to purchase the data.
Yeah. Sarah, I wanted to ask you if during your kind of interviews with the companies, or like write a reply, did you have any pushback on the veracity of the data you were using?
No, none at all. I think that the companies are still, there is still some kind of plausible deniability because there isn't the direct link between the farms to the data. But no, actually, the most common response was, I think, from beef companies, that they know that this is a problem, that they are working on it, and that right now it's impossible for them to know what's happening earlier, way earlier in their supply chain, but that that they're working on it. And I guess from soy companies, it was a little bit different. The soy world is sort of a little bit different from the beef world, in that there are kind of pretty strong Brazilian soy lobbies, and then there are these big trading companies, and those groups sometimes like work together and then sometimes they don't. And so in this case, there was kind of a split where the the big kind of traders and exporters are more willing to say sort of this is an issue and we're working on it, but they kind of blamed the Brazilian kind of soy lobbies, and then the Brazilian soy lobbies, tended to say, actually, we're already being asked to do far more than we should be. They have this moratorium on soy from the Amazon that has been in place for a while and has made a difference. I mean, a lot of the deforestation with soy is now happening in the Cerrado, and they point out, that actually that's completely legal and that it's not fair that they're not allowed to be doing more deforestation when the law says that they can in the Amazon. And so I think like there's some kind of there's some sort of strategic questions that need to be worked out, in the world of people that are trying to make a difference on this, and in terms of like how to get some of these farmers on board. Because right now, I think the Brazilian kind of medium-sized soy farmers who are providing to these exporters that we're painting a spotlight on are completely, averse to this kind of data, and that has been a problem.
Yeah, I can imagine. So there's a few questions as well about the kind of timeliness and updating of the data. So when obviously trade routes, supply chains are changing quite frequently. So how much weight is it reasonable for journalists using the data to place on these data sets?
So there has been a really interesting research done recently on the stickiness of the supply chains. Because in the case of soy, for example, they have to build big infrastructure, right, to be able to store, to process, to transport soy from farm to the port and to the crushing facilities. So the research has shown that there is a stickiness. It's more likely that the company who builds a silo and a crushing facility that will keep purchasing soy from around those areas. So there is this, although the data is only for 2018 now. We assume that it won't be that different for 2020 or 2021 because there is a stickiness in the supply chain. In terms of timeline, we do want to update for 2018 and 2020. I mean, because of this new gaps in the data now, we are sort of, it takes more time to be able to update the data. But the beef model, we are to update the beef model in the quarter 4 of this year, and hopefully the same for soy. But I can, if anyone has any questions about specific commodities, please feel free to ask, and then I can get back.
Okay, great. Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead, Tom. I just had a question for Sarah. So.
I had a question for Sarah as well. I guess from your point of view as a journalist using these data sets, like, were you approaching them as a way to give you an idea of a links and a basis to start your investigation, or were you using the data as kind of verified?
Well, I think actually both, and we sort of split this story in two. I did the sort of more text-based story that involved talking to the companies and trying to understand not only kind of what the connections are, but also why more progress hasn't been made. And so for me, it was really the former. I kind of read the reports that Trase had put out and looked at the data and then used that as kind of a guide to which companies to talk to. And then a colleague of mine who's on our data team and deserves all of the credit for the beautiful visualization. He really kind of dug in and was working, with the data set, and so it was useful to us in both ways.
I just had a question for you, Sarah, on because I mean, we now, with the new regulations coming up in Europe, in UK, we're seeing that some regions, the EU, for example, is focusing on any type of deforestation. The UK is only focused on illegal deforestation, and the report that we published last year was on the illegal deforestation. So do you think that narrative of illegality makes it easier to, as an entry point?
No, absolutely. And you probably remember we were sort of asking, what do you have? Can you tell us which of this is illegal? I mean, what is, because I think it does, it makes a difference in terms of kind of readers saying that it's illegal is just, it's easier to kind of explain. But I think it also, as I was saying earlier, allows, showing that it's illegal allows us to kind of confront that narrative of the government that says that the kind of illegal actors are these, rogue bands of criminals with chainsaws. And so to be able to say, actually illegal, you can tie something that's illegal to these big companies. And, maybe they're not the ones with the chainsaws, but they haven't figured out a way to kind of reduce that illegality. I was meaningful. And so I guess even when we didn't have that, there are ways to still, we were able to say, the data doesn't break down what's legal. Sorry, I've got a cat here. What's legal and what's illegal, but but we know from other reports that 97% is illegal. And so I think that kind of sticking that sentence in is enough to tell a reader, most of what we're talking about, even though we can't kind of split it up, is illegal deforestation. But it's useful. I mean, it's useful. I think it is useful. And I know that Trase has sort of been working on trying to kind of particularly document the illegal deforestation, which requires different data, figuring out where people had permits and where they didn't. And I think that is really useful and important work, for the companies as well, because a lot of this, I mean, we sometimes forget that the Amazon is just this massive, vast, amount of land. But then when you kind of zoom in, it's all, like a patchwork quilt in the kind of way that it's broken up. And so often the kind of deforestation is happening on one little chunk of a farm, and then maybe it's not being used. And so there's a lot of but I think, I think that complexity has been used for decades now to argue that there's no way to control this. But you introduce satellites and the whole game changes. I mean, suddenly you can actually look at exactly what's happening on this little piece of this larger farm, and how that maps up to the permit that was filed in the state office that approves deforestation permits. And so suddenly what used to be kind of total vacuum is now really quite easy, maybe not easy, but at least very possible to to document. And I think that that's really important.
Great. One more for you. So how, to what extent do you feel having this data behind you made it easier for you to approach big companies and engage them in a conversation, as opposed to kind of having anecdotal evidence and examples?
Yeah, I think it was important. I definitely think it was important. I think it was important to have the data. It was also important that the question that we came to them with in this case was sort of, we want to understand what your company is doing and why it's going so slowly, rather than, why are you committing illegal deforestation? And there have been other uses of trace data that have been, much more kind of, I guess, confrontational, or more, really clearly pointing to companies for the, their colossal mismanagement and so on and so forth. But we kind of decided that we thought that the value of this story would be greater, given what was already out there from other outlets, if we were able to speak to these companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So more one for you, Andre, I think, on the methodology. and the kind of assigning of risk to different commodities. So obviously there's overlap in some of the deforestation. So, you know, some of the land that's being cleared for soy, maybe kind of timber or beef involved as well. So how do you assign to particular ones, and what's your methodology for that?
That's another really good question. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a matter of decision whether we double count that risk or not. And so we are still discussing this internally, as we are now publishing more information on maize and soy, which they are cropped in the same area. It's a double crop. And what we are seeing is, I mean, it really depends. From our perspective, is we want to allocate that risk. We think, you know, beef and soy, it's a common pattern, so we should double count. We should allocate the responsibility for both, right? The maize and soy is a difficult question, because although they're exactly on the same land, and that's exactly what we want to look for, right? To more sustainable management of the land use. So we still haven't decided, but we are kind of inclined to double count, to say like this deforestation is for soy, this deforestation is for you know, it's been planted on recently forested areas.
Okay, thanks. So one other question, I guess, kind of for both of you, is how collaborative was the process from both points of view, working with Sarah and The Economist, and Sarah working with Trace? Like, how much kind of conversation back and forth was there between you two while you were?
Andre might have a better idea, because I think you know, James was on our data team, was more of the sort of point person. I mean, for me, my kind of involvement was a couple long conversations with Andre to sort of understand the methodology and understand the reports I was reading. I think that was kind of the first one, and then one later on, you know, to sort of vet some of the things that I've been hearing from companies and ask kind of how they checked out with the data, and both of that was useful. But Andre would know sort of how the ins and outs of kind of adapting the data to our own sort of graphic system worked.
I mean, I have to say that it was an impressive work together, a collaborative work. It's really hard to see that, and it was really interesting to work with Sarah and James, because they were, you know, asking a lot of questions to really try to understand the data, and we know the complexity of the data. And before that, we never hosted or never had a training session like that to explain the methods, the limitations, and so on. I think now it's becoming clear for journalists who use Trace what are the limitations, what you can do, what you can't say with the data. And that was a really good exercise with Sarah and James, you know, to discuss that in detail, say like, is this actually, you know, in the beginning, it seemed like we are allocating deforestation to the companies, so the companies are responsible, not to extent, you know. So that discussion was super helpful, super useful to make sure the graphs, the maps, and the information was you know, well packaged.
Okay, and then a quick follow-up, I guess. So journalists who want to engage in a similar kind of collaborative process, how do they get in contact with you? What's the best? We
have, I mean, I'm happy. I mean, we can send my email afterwards. You can contact me directly, or we have another email, info@Trase.earth, that we receive many queries from there, and then we just distribute within the team.
Great, thanks. And then one further question. I mean, you've already alluded kind of to the problems of data acquisition from Europe, but there are, you know, obviously problems with deforestation, illegal logging in Poland, for instance. Do you have any plans to try and include Europe and European countries too?
As a producing country?
As deforestation risk on the ground in Europe?
No, we really want to keep focus on tropical areas where most of the deforestation is happening for those commodities. So
it's a priority question, I guess.
Yeah, because it's really difficult to map those commodities. So we have a limited team, so we want to keep focus on.
Sure. Maybe in the future when you have unlimited capacity and a huge team.
Exactly.
Fingers crossed. Okay, I think we have answered everyone's questions, it seems. Are there any other kind of comments or points that you guys want to raise?
No, I think from my side, I just want to thanks again, Tom, and all the team to, to have this space to show more of the data. And as I said before, we are very happy to receive queries, to help or to host more events, to have more events like that to train. It's a big part of the new 5-year strategy is the deployment part, is the impact side. And for that, we know that we need to improve our how we communicate our methods, how, the accessibility of the methods and so on. So we are working the next few months in an engagement toolkit, which is basically, a series of short videos, some documents that explain the methods, the limitations in more detail, but also in a more digestible way. And once we have those materials, we can then share with the group.
Yeah, just thanks very much for having me. It was great to be able to work together, and I'm glad to help other journalists in some small way understand how to use this data.
Well, thank you to you, Sarah and Andre, for giving us some of your time and taking us through this. I hope people have found it useful, and I hope I've been able to paraphrase your questions reasonably accurately. But if not, or if you have questions that come up occur to you later on, then Andre's email is in the slides, so you can maybe just put them to him directly. But yeah, otherwise, thank you both very much.